citizen.
Out of many
we are world citizens. Same vision is for equal rights and justice for the people them. What's happening to this beautiful world that we're living in? World citizen, lift up your voices.
Welcome everyone to another episode of the People Powered Planet podcast, where each week we have amazing solutionaries, people who are not just focused on all the incredible problems of the world, but on the solutions that can turn it around, what Garry called a people-powered planet. And today we have a very special guest. We have Shann Turnbull. Shann the man Turnbull with a plan. Shann the man with a plan. I think Garry picked him because he's a man who indeed has incredible plans. He's a system scientist, and he's actually given talks about how system scientists are needed essential to preventing the world from extinction. He heads and founded the International Institute for Self-Governance and the Sustainable Money Working Group. He has a master's from Harvard and a PhD in business administration and the science of governance. He's actually studied governance, and he gives talks to all kinds of key groups in the financial area and in the area of governance and new ways of governing our world. I think his books, of course, he has over 30 books. We'll talk about some of them, including his new way to govern organizations and societies after Enron and so on. But before I do, let me just say, welcome, Shann. Good to have you with us.
Thank you for having me. And it's delightful to have some of my local colleagues in Australia joining in. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, we're so glad you could join us from Sydney, Australia. I know our normal time would have been 3 a.m, so we've adjusted that, and I think this will work out great. Tell me a little bit more about how you first met Garry and why he picked you to be his economics commissioner.
Well, I've been going to a lot of academic conferences in the United States, and Garry would pop up at them. And I don't know quite how we connected. I did do some work lived in Burlington, which is in Garry's area. And I was invited there to reconstruct a defunct company, which I then brought to Australia to make a little moon buggy called a Jack Tractor. So I think that's where we first became associated. Then he kept on meeting at various conferences in the United States. And he invited me to write some articles for the World Citizens News, which I did for about 5 years. And during that time, I proposed the idea that we needed a tether for money, that official money wasn't related to any reality. It was really funny money, and we needed, and it was destroying the planet, as Lord Stern advised the UK government that climate change is the biggest market failure the world has ever seen. So markets are the problem, not the solution.
The markets are the failure, not the solution. Wow. Well, you, in your book, A New Way to Govern, you talk about how the old command and control hierarchies just can't begin to cope with the complexity of human diversity, and they can't regulate themselves. We're thinking they'd regulate themselves. Tell us a little bit more about what you found is the way to restructure governance in this era.
Well, it's not taught at any graduate school of business, public administration, or government. It's bottom-up governance as well as top-down. And the people that have been doing it for 65,000 years are Australian Indigenous Aboriginals. And they've sustained both themselves and their government by having mainly bottom-up decision-making. So the Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize in 2009 for identifying how for thousands of years traditional societies have been avoiding what they call the tragedy of the commons, where people acting in their self-interest compete for life-sustaining resources to deny them for everyone. And economists throughout the world thought that is the way the world should go, because the way the world is organized is in command and control hierarchies, which have no systemic feedback and self-regulation built into them. And Ellen Ostrom, who's a political scientist, not an economist, won the Nobel Prize for identifying how you need what she called polycentric governance, which sounds a bit of a complicated word, but it's really describing distributed decision-making. And to have distributed decision-making, you need to change the charter of organizations to share the power with everybody, all the stakeholders. And there's marvelous examples of distributed decision-making around the world. And in the United Kingdom, you have the John Lewis Partnership. In the United States, you have the Visa Card Organization. And in Europe, you have the Mondragon Nested Network of Cooperatives. And we have polycentric governance in sporting bodies around the world without, and Ellen Ostrom's Nobel Prize speech formed out how to get self-governance without markets or hierarchy. You don't need markets or hierarchy for self-governance. What you need is distributed power. And we don't have that in our most dominant institutions, which are undermining democracy. And the most gifted future leaders of the world are being educated how to manage command and control hierarchies, which undermines democracy. And this is why the number of democracies in the world is decreasing, because they're getting subverted by the powers of big business and big government.
Wow, that is a major crisis we face. And it was so fascinating to me that Dee Hock founded Visa as a chaotic organization, he called it, which was all the stakeholders being involved. We think of Visa, as this, everybody goes out, scans, uses their Visa as part of all these different credit cards. But one reason why it can be used by so many different banks and so many different places is that he did engineer it as chaotic, that all the stakeholders had a role. There's no single person kind of controlling it and making money on it. They're all part of it. So that's something many people aren't aware of. And it's interesting you pointed to Visa as one of these examples.
It's a marvelous example. And as Dee Hock says, it has hundreds of boards of directors within the one legal entity. Now, that's unheard of. All listed companies in the world have a single board. In Europe, they may have a supervisory board, and the single board has absolute power to corrupt the individuals, absolutely, the business, absolutely, and corrupt the auditor and corrupt the organization and society. That is why we're corrupting the world and the environment, because there's no systemic checks and balances and feedback coming back. Now, Dee Hock, you coined the word chaotic from saying a combination of chaos and order. Now, Buckminster Fuller identified the same phenomenon in structural, and he designed his geared stones, which are made up of structures which have contrary properties of tension and compression. And all humans are hardwired to have contrary properties, but we can't have contrary properties in command and control hierarchies. It's a group think. And so this is why we're heading for the cliff of destruction.
An amazing fellow who has also talked about bottom-up governance. And when we got to go to his lovely home and meet with him, and he's an amazing guy.
It's great. I think he's still alive, and he's a prophet of the way we should go. And this is what we should be introducing to the curriculums of our schools and universities, of how you have this bottom-up governance. And when I suggested it to the Dean of Harvard Business School at my 25th reunion, I said, why don't you do it? And he said, oh, there's no market for it. And of course, it's a chicken and egg problem. Unless there's a market, you're not going to get the leading business schools to educate people of how to save the world. And in Dee Hock's situation, it exhibits this, what cell biologist Donald Ingber calls the architecture of life. And that is, he uses the Bucky Fuller word of tensegrity. It's the same as chaotic. So apparently Dee Hock wasn't aware of the word tensegrity that Bucky Fuller coined. And the organization of the Visa is that every bank has its own board of directors issuing its own credit cards, but they compete with each other. So it's both cooperation and competition within the one organization. And that is the definition of disegrity, where you have opposite, paradoxical, complementary behaviors in the same person.
Well, that's so interesting, because that's what Garry talked about when he designed what he called integrity, working with Bucky Fuller and Bucky Fuller's disciple to design that. And the geodesic sphere, as you mentioned, is one of the most perfect structures in terms of tensile strength and so on. And all the struts interact. And the key is that the strength comes from the tension. The tension actually increases the strength and makes the whole thing work. The whole thing stays up because of the tension. So instead of tension tearing us apart, it's what's pulling us together.
Well, it's all shared together. There's tension and compression. Our bodies are designed the same way. Our bones are good in compression, our muscles are good in tension, and they both work to provide checks and balances on each other. Now, Garry got that idea from a leading system scientist called Stafford Beer. And Stafford Beer pioneered the application of cybernetics to business management. And because we both wrote for World Citizen News, we met together in Toronto in about 1998, and met with Stafford Beer, who'd been through being mutual authors of the Citizen News.
Yeah, well, that was a time when Garry had so many people applying for world passports that they were able to actually hire Stafford Beer to develop this integrity system of governance. And it was before the internet. And once the internet came out, Garry was just so excited because now we can create that kind of tensile strength of interaction. And in a way, we're in this right now. It's in his case, it was like small groups, like this group right now, this number of people interacting in a structure that was like Bucky's Fuller's, where no one person is on top, or we all can be involved in creating decisions, and using that structure to actually evolve a system where we're not getting together. Like, say we were having this Zoom meeting, but we had people on opposite sides of political issues. We had Arabs and Israelis, or Democrats and Republicans, or whatever. And our objective is not who's right and who's wrong, because then we'll just argue it out and fight it out. But say we, like a system scientist, have a menu of interactive techniques that help bring us to win-win conclusions. Like, what is it that each person really wants inside? What is their vision for the future? What do they want for their children and their grandchildren? And we start finding we have common bounds. And when we start saying, not asking the question who's right or who's wrong, and not sending people off by horse and buggy to a distant city to represent us, not representative democracy, which was something great in 1776 when there was no telephone or even internet, but us all directly, interactively, bottom up, helping to govern our world, when the question is not who's right and who's wrong, but what's best for our planet, what's best for our survival, we start having incredible commonality. We start finding we're coming to the same conclusions and the same decisions. And if all these interactive little groups, if each one of these separate geodesic spheres is connected to the other geodesic spheres, we have a whole planet of interactive small groups that are being amalgamated into the will of the people of the planet. And that's what the Declaration of Independence says. The will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. Garry was kind of the first guy who said, now, wait a minute. They're saying right here in the Declaration of Independence, it is the right of the people to institute new government. Now, who are they talking about? Who are these people? Is it old guys in gray wigs? or is it you and me? Do we actually have the right to institute new government? And if we do, then why are we knocking our heads against the wall trying to convince these guys that we hired to run these imaginary things? There's no real lines. As we saw in Europe, the lines all came down, and people just drew these lines. They're maps. They're lines on a map. There's not really a line between Mexico and the U.S. Somebody drew a line across a map. And when we get to the real things, how do we, the people, interact? And we get past being stuck in this nation state thinking. It seems we can do something different. And then that's the kind of thing I think you were talking about when you talked about this new way of governing. Another book called Democratizing the Wealth of Nations. You talked about modeling it after nature. How do we begin to create? How do we learn from nature how to govern our world?
Well, we've got to change the rules of ownership. Instead of being static, exclusive, and perpetual, like in corporations, we've got to have nature's rules. If you use it or you lose it. So you want to have dynamic, inclusive, time-limited rules in corporations. So that's what my book was about, is introducing a way that corporations automatically converted the stakeholders automatically got converted into shareholders. And so you got bottom-up governance mixed in with top-down governance. Now, you talked about integrity, that you gave a marvelous explanation of that. It only works at the grace and favor of the people within an organization. So if you're in a corporation with a single board, it's only at the grace and favor of management that you can introduce that. And Stafford Beer said he never applied integrity to corporate governance. So it's a great idea, but you need to hardwire it into the constitution of companies. And I don't know of any university that now teaches how to design corporate constitutions so power is distributed like D. Hock did and have 100 boards, or what they do in Mondragon or they do in the John Lewis Partnership. It's an intellectual void throughout the higher education of this bottom-up governance. So it's not at the grace and favor of management, but it is required by the private rules of how you run corporations or by your culture. Traditional Australians have done it for 65,000 years, the longest living culture in the world. And we need to learn from them and get them to teach us how they make decision makers in the way you so beautifully described.
Well, that's very good that you mentioned, the Aboriginal cultures and kind of something more innate. Here we are talking about these complex thoughts. You need a PhD from Harvard to think about them. And yet here, Aboriginal people, simple people are thinking of them. And that's something, my dad told me as we were growing up. He said, currency is a really good name for money because currency is a current, a flow. And he said, if you have a currency, that's making the lights run and making things, your motors run in your house, but if you turn off the switch, the current isn't flowing, and then there's nothing there. It's gone. It only exists as long as it's flowing. And he said, it's the same thing with money. He said, if I take a small town, you talked about indigenous communities, a traditional town, okay, and I give $100 to a shoemaker, and he goes out and buys the leather and supplies he needs and food and stuff, and so that money goes to those people, and they buy from the farmer, and the farmer buys his tools and so forth from the metal maker, and and around the circle that $100 is flowing around and around, and people are doing things, prospering. But as soon as you either tighten the money, you say, oh, wait a minute, bad times are ahead, we better hold on to it. There's no flow. It's like turning off the light switch. There's no current. But also, there's no current if you put it into making bombs. Nobody can then use the bomb like they could, when the farmer, buys seeds, he grows things out of it. When the tailor buys the cloth, he's making something else that can be sold. But nobody can eat, buy, or do anything with a bomb except destroy the world. So that's sort of a dead end. And all of the things that are that aren't regenerative, that aren't cyclical, all lead to a dead end and stop the current. And so he told us that what we need to do is create currency. And I know you've done a little videos and you've done talks about how we create money that like right now, cryptocurrencies, so many of them, you don't spend them, right? Because if you hold on, it's going to be worth more. But you have another idea about how to make current flow. What is that?
This is having a negative interest rate built into money. Official money is not fit for purpose. Money carries out three functions. It should only carry out one. And digital technology allows us to simplify money so it only does one purpose, and one purpose only is exactly as you described it, as a medium of exchange. That's what it should do. And as Lord Keane said in 1923, money should do its purpose, allow for the exchange of goods and services, and then disappear. The problem of the official money and the cryptocurrencies is they don't self-liquidate. They don't have a use-by date. They don't follow the rules of nature. The rules of nature, things die and get rebirthed. And then you democratize money. Anybody can create it because the other functions of money, being a unit of account or a unit of value, is carried out by other institutions. In the old days, of course, they used to use life-sustaining commodities like wheat and grain for money, or salt. And then they found that metal was more convenient, but that favored those countries which had those metals. What we need is a tether for money, a tether which is indexed to the sustainability of life on Earth. Economic value, there's no word in Aboriginal languages for economic value because in nature, there's no concept of economic value. There's only the concept of life. You cannot have this social construct, this imaginary totem or religion of money, which is not defined by anything. It's just a religion. It's a faith-based system and not connected to reality. We need to connect a medium of exchange to reality by having it tethered to an index. Now, if you want to store value, you need something which sustains life, like, as you said, a farm or solar cells, something which is renewable in eternity, in perpetuity, so humans can live on this planet in perpetuity. It's no use going to another planet because we don't have the rich biodiversity. And you need biodiversity to avoid inbreeding. And the Australian Aborigines avoided that for tens of thousands of years. And we need to nurture diversity and not just spend our billionaires going to other planets. They should spend their money on education systems so we can govern the planet from the bottom up.
Absolutely. We need that new model for how we govern. And that's, of course, what Garry Davis's life was about and why we made the movie, The World is My Country, and what inspired this whole podcast. And, it's very interesting to use the example of nature because our economy currently is built on the idea of scarcity. But nature is built on unlimited abundance. You take a little tiny seed and it can grow a mighty tree. Everything is created in nature. Everything is created like by magic out of nothing. It keeps regenerating and growing. And as long as it's fertilized and you bring in the different, as you mentioned, biodiverse elements, and as long as it has that cyclical nature, there's no limit. It can go on forever. And that's the same out of economy. We could all live very well if we were living in a cyclical, regenerative economy where we're now able to get services. People are taking care of us as we get elderly. People are helping us take care of our kids. People want to serve others. There are far more people in pain because they can't give of all the things they want to give to the world than they can't get. The economy is built on, everybody wants. No, most people wish they could do more. And proof of that is things like when YouTube started off, everybody's making all these videos, or not because anybody's paying them to do it. Now, later they did start paying them, but at first it was just because we want to express ourselves. We want to have an impact, and people do plays, music, other things, because they want to give their creative most to the world. So we need an economy that seems to me that captures our need to give rather than just our need to grab and get. Isn't that right?
That is correct. And the most biggest investor in the world, Larry Fink, the chairman and chief executive of BlackRock, says in 2018 he made an announcment to all the companies he invested in that he wanted them to benefit all their stakeholders. And he was a member of the very powerful US Business Roundtable, and all the 180 chief executive officers of the largest corporations of the world agreed with him and says our corporate purpose should be not just benefiting shareholders, but all their stakeholders. The problem is they don't have a credible process for achieving that purpose. And one way of doing it is providing a tax incentive for shareholders to change the corporate constitutions to provide a bigger profit for shareholders if and only if they change the corporate constitution to share so that a small percentage of the equity of that company is automatically transferred to a new class of stakeholder shares each year, a small percentage year. Say it was 5%. So at the end of 20 years, the company is converted from a shareholder company to a stakeholder company. And the shareholders would get a bigger profit quicker, And the institutional investors that have got to maximize their short-term profits would be legally obliged to vote at the annual general meeting to change corporate constitutions to create a new way to govern. And
wow.
and this is a very, politicians of the world, this is a way of winning government or maintaining government, because you're promising your voters that they'll all become owners of corporations. They become investors. They earn their points according to their consumption. The more they consume, the more points and shares they get in the companies, or the more they work for the companies. So you'd share it with all stakeholders. So you want contestation between the various stakeholders' interests, like they do in Aboriginal communities. Different people, you're doing it on a global basis, what traditional people do at a local basis. And this seems to be an irresistible way for politicians to get elected, because they're getting their votes from the big powerful business leaders. They're getting the votes from all their citizens, because stakeholder shares can only be granted and given. They're gifted to individual voters in that tax jurisdiction. And then they actually end up paying tax, and the government gets more tax back than the incentive that it gives. So it's a self-funding way of changing corporations which live forever to have to live the same life as patents, which is 20 years. The problem is economists don't understand that investors can get overpaid. And the reason they don't understand is because accounting doctrines don't allow accountants to report when investors get paid more money than they require to get the incentive to invest. And it comes from because investors aren't fortune tellers. They don't know what the future is like. And they always invest with a time limited in mind. It's called a time horizon. And a lot of investors' time horizons, like share traders, it's just a few hours in a day. Venture capitalists might go out a couple of years, and serious investors might go out 5 or 10 years. But there's no commercial reason for all productive things wear out. And so time-limited investments is the norm. And I've raised millions of dollars offering investors only 15-year leases. And I've floated 2 companies on the Australian Stock Exchange on that basis. So the extent you allow ownership longer than 15 or 20 years, you're giving them, the owners, profits in excess of their incentive to invest. And this is a way of funding a universal living income for all humans on the planet. And
oh my God, there's so many fantastic ideas caught up in that. And how come Thomas Jefferson knew that several hundred years ago? Didn't they know his day corporations were given a 20-year charter that would automatically expire?
After the English developed corporations as a way of privatizing colonization. And the Hudson Bay Company and the Virginia Company, they used corporations as private, and the East India Company. So when the Americans had the War of Independence to fight for their independence, they didn't want to be recolonized by the English again. And so corporations could only be created under state laws. And the states said, we will not charter any company in perpetuity. It has limited life. And governments which allow foreign investors to get ownership in perpetuity are committing economic sabotage and accepting foreign investment in perpetuity. And a famous economist called Edith Penrose pointed out that as soon as you get direct foreign investment, the host countries is committed to an unlimited, unknown, and uncontrolled foreign liabilities to pay back in perpetuity, which is ridiculous. It's defrauding the host citizens of their income.
So in Jefferson's day, corporations were chartered to serve a particular public good, like to build a railroad. And when that was finished, it would expire. And if they misbehaved, the government could pull their charter. They could pull it. Right.
They canceled the charter.
Exactly. But then, because we, the people, are locked in these boxes called nation states, and corporations could act globally, multinational corporations, they gained all the power, and they began to, get the best politicians money could buy and say, if you try to regulate us, well, we'll just move elsewhere where we can be tax-free, where we can pollute to our heart's content. And so they gained all the power, and we, the people, lost our power because we're stuck in this box. And what we need to do now, what Garry said, to break out of that box and to move from being the governed to the governors of our planet?
I agree, and this is why it's marvelous that the BlackRock, which owns 10% of all listed equities in the world, has saying the corporate purpose should be to serve the benefits of stakeholders as well as shareholders. And this is why there's now a compelling argument for politicians to give tax deductions to shareholders that transform corporations into an ecological form so they follow the laws of nature and serve the people, as you were saying.
Wow. Well, now how can we all be a part of that? Wow. I mean, that sounds beautiful. I know there is an effort, maybe Melanie will tell you about it later, called SEED, which is creating a kind of one of these bottom-up constitutions.
I went to research it because you told me about it, and it's not clear, and it's too complicated, and it's not. It seems to be a way of. It has great good intentions, but I could not identify the Constitution. I couldn't become a member of it, and I'd be very careful in promoting SEED until there's greater disclosure. It says all the right words. It's like the CEO saying, yes, we want to serve stakeholders, but they don't have a process for doing it. And Well,
we can follow up on that later. Thank you. That's very good feedback. Well, pretty soon we're going to turn this open to questions. So if anybody has questions, begin to put them in the chat, raise your hand and so on. And I'll turn it over shortly to Melanie to take your questions, comments, input, and so on. But I first want to start with saying, I noticed that in 2013, you did a little video called Lifeboat Money.
Yes.
And in some ways, we've had these sort of an experiment, I think. Maybe you can tell us more about it, in these payments that we've made that were for where everybody in the country, without any other reason, just in being alive, were able to get these stimulus payments. Does that kind of begin to reflect experimenting some of the ideas you had in Lifeboat Money? Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, it was what has happened in the Great Depression when the Federal Reserve failed to be a reserve bank and couldn't bail out the banks. Local communities created their own currencies. Local city-states and states issued their own self-financing, self-liquidating money. And it was called stamp script because they put up these notes, and at the back of the note, there'd be 52 little squares that would put a stamp on it. And the stamp had to be 2 cents for every dollar face value of the note. So if you bought 52 stamps of 2 cents, you spent $1.04. And the person that issued the note would then make a 4-cent profit when they redeemed that note at the end of the year. So it was currency issued by cities and states which liquidated, paid for itself, got redeemed at the end of 1 year. It lasted 1 year. It's exactly your story of money being a currency circulating. And the 2 cents paid per week sounds, that's very expensive. That's a 104% interest rate or more. But it isn't, because if you don't hold the money, you don't pay for the stamp. You use it or lose it. And if you only hold the money for 1 day, you're only paying 1/365th of the 2 cents, which is much smaller than what the commission you would on a credit card. So stamp script would be much more efficient and profitable for merchants than the monopoly funny money, this undefinable totem official money that we've presently got, and better than any of those cryptocurrencies, which are even worse.
So you went on to say in that little video, Lifeboat Money, to say we could move from stamps into something that's right there in our cell phones, where it's money. So tell us about that.
Well, you need to have a tether to tether the value of the stamps to, and most tethers people use official money. So simply using and it's exactly what any city could do with its transit system. They issued debit cards to pay to go on the trains or the trams and buses and so on. Or they could just put helicopter money into those debit cards, but you have to use it, or if you didn't use it, you lost it.
Now,
And
it's interesting. We think of a helicopter as something kind of appears in the sky, sort of out of nowhere. It appears, but many of us don't know that that's actually an official economic term, right?
yes, you talk about helicopter money as sort of dropping money. Friedman talked about dropping money from the sky.
Uh, so in a way that happened with the stimulus payment, but imagine that that payment came connected with an app that said, okay, you're getting the stimulus dollar, and the more and the more you spend it in this green economy, things that are circular and regenerative, the more you'll have. You'll keep getting
No,
it
no, no, no. You've
periodically.
got to be
But if
careful.
you
The
don't,
stimulus, we're having stimulus money in Australia now. The state government has giveaway money, but it's money which they have to borrow or pay taxes to finance. It's not self-financing money. And you talk about a stimulating money, but there's no incentive to use it unless it has a negative interest rate. And that is the
right.
problem.
So if we knew every month it's going to lose 1% in value, we would spend it more quickly, but hopefully spend it on things that are somehow organized so that they're into a regenerative economy rather than spending it on things that are going to continue to destroy the planet.
Hopefully, yes.
So that's
But
the
you've
kind of
got to have
system
the
we need to
negative
invent.
interest rate. Money is not fit for purpose unless it's self-liquidating. And that's what Keynes said in 1923. And what we're creating is money which lives forever. And it's just, it's inflating the amount of artificial assets in the world relative to the real assets which sustain life. And we're committing economic suicide.
I love that. I love that idea because I think what we're doing is really, as you said, getting closer to nature, but also we're really, and what's exciting to me about it is you're talking about something that really some major economic players now are beginning to get behind. Are there some examples of where we've actually been able to do this, of communities where it's been working? Are there some ways this can become more than just kind of an intellectual exercise and to show that, hey, that we can do this, folks?
Yes, it's they're issuing negative interest rate money again in Germany. It's quite legal. There's no laws against private people issuing private money. But at the moment, it has to be tethered to the funny official money, which is not tethered to anything in reality. So it is possible. And there's 5,000 local currencies in the world. There's a local currency association. And so it's happening all the time in local communities. But there's very few of them that have self-liquidating money. They normally they try to replicate the official money, which is not fit for purpose because it's too complicated, it tries too many things, it tries to be a unit of account, a store of value, as well as a medium of exchange, which is too complicated. We should keep it simple, sweetheart.
Well, didn't Garry and you talk about tethering it to the kilowatt? Garry invented what he called the kilowatt dollar. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, I've been writing about kilowatt hour money. I suggested in an editorial in our national newspaper in 1978, the idea of tethering official money to renewable energy. And so it was renewable energy dollars that I was promoting. It's a commodity-backed money. And I've refined the idea that rather than it's one way of defining a unit of value. All modern societies need energy to sustain life. So you want renewable energy, which you can have internally to sustain life eternally. So it is a commodity which is connected to sustaining life on the planet. But you need more than that. You've got to make sure that you don't burn carbon as well. So I then suggested a tether. The tether should be a ratio of the renewable energy to the non-renewable energy. So if you're burning, so you get an index of sustainability. Those countries that burn carbon, say, for 40% of their power, their dollars would only be worth 40% of other areas which were fully renewable, like my little state of Tasmania, which is nearly all hydroelectric power. And they would have the most valuable currency because they're the most sustainable and could sustain life on Earth for much longer than those that are burning carbon.
Wow, that is really exciting. It's so good talking to you, and I'm so excited that Garry picked you for this important position because it really is the kind of innovation that we need to, right now we have COP coming up, and we're seeing how totally incapable. The existing nation state system is to do more than just talk about things, make recommendations, and not even really follow up in them, and hardly even follow those steps. What do you see as ways of bringing this into the real world functioning? And what do you see happening right now with like COP, and how can we move it towards something like what you're talking about?
Well, the system scientists have a law of requisite variety to managing complexity, and that means you've got a complex thing like the degradation of the atmosphere, oceans, soils, and a lack of biodiversity means it's got to be bottom-up solutions. And to get bottom-up solutions, you've got to get the 8 billion people on this planet all engaged in reducing the rate of births and not degrading their host environment. And one way of engaging with those 8 billion people is through corporations, not nation states. And one way to make corporations the agents for change and transformation of capitalism to a sustainable society is give tax deductions, give the tax incentives to people to change the constitution of corporations. And you just need some politicians to provide leadership to show how you can win and maintain government by transforming capitalism with tax incentives. And this bottom-up governance will then enrich democracy, and it might even catch on in communist countries.
I see in the chat, Michael putting some things about COP26, and of course that one of the challenges is that it is sort of top-down rather than bottom-up, although there are a terrific number of people working on trying to promote that. But it seems to me that one of the key problems is we keep trying to think we should beg and plead and convince existing leaders to make these changes. And Garry said, you know, why don't we the people, instead of banging our heads against the wall, not instead of, I mean, yeah, keep trying to get them to make those changes, but why don't we also just start doing it from the bottom up? Is there some way that people, you know, now that we see that in cryptocurrencies, for example, it used to be just nation states put out currencies, but now, you know, all kinds of other people can do it. We also see in so many other areas that new things are being created that weren't before. How do we actually start to do this without waiting for the broken nation state system to self-reform itself?
I'm holding up a cover of a book called Building Sustainable Communities, Tools and Concepts for Self-reliant Economic Change. And this book are the lecture notes that the E.F. Schumacher Society in Massachusetts gave. We had these series of 6-day live-in lectures to community leaders of ideas for self-reliant economic change from the bottom up. And it talked about changing the rules of, we had land trusts and we had local currencies and worker-owned corporations.
But it's so fascinating to see how ahead of the curve you are and how crucial this is needed. And what do you think about, there are now for-benefit corporations getting started. Is that part of what we're talking about here?
No, it's greenwash.
That's greenwashing, huh?
They don't change the corporate constitution.
Uh-huh.
It's at the grace and favor. They have a single board of directors, and any organization with a single board of directors provides them with absolute power to identify and manage their own conflicts of interest, and absolute power, as Lord Aston said, corrupts the individuals absolutely. It corrupts the organization and it corrupts society. And it sounds good, but it doesn't change the power, the rules of the power game. And that's what universities do not teach, how to design democratic power structures. And this is why democracy is going out of fashion.
Well, now, if we're depending on getting tax benefits for doing this, then we're depending on getting through Congress that's so dominated by the current existing corporate interests, new ways of taxing corporations. Isn't that like an incredible mountain to climb? I mean, is there some way this can happen?
Not at all, because the stakeholder shares are only issued to voting citizens. It's exactly what Garry said. It's we the people, we the voters want to be issued shares in all corporations, and you give tax deductions to the shareholders to change their corporate constitutions So we get a little bit of equity each year, and you create a universal well-being income. So you reduce welfare, you reduce the size of government, you reduce taxes, you reduce the size of government, and you have self-regulation. The stakeholders become the regulators rather than having top-down, inefficient, ineffective bureaucrats regulating the private sector.
Wow, let's go to questions now, because I'm sure you've stimulated a lot of thinking today.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for this. You're full of information. And as far as seeds is concerned, I think it'd be very interesting to maybe have you and Reiki Corden, who's one of the facilitators of seeds. He is going to be on our podcast on November 17th. I know that's going to be early for you. So maybe there's something we can do where later you're discussing with Reiki what seeds is all about. It's incredible. And it's new, and it needs your voice. It needs your voice.
They could learn from you.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. They are open to evolving. It's not just, oh, we know the way. They want everyone to participate and help. And it's also, it's just basically a motivation. It's a motivation for us to do the right thing. So all this, everything you've just said, would be so interesting to speak again about. So everybody come the 17th of November for Reiki Corden, and you can go to that website. It's joinseeds.org. Let's go to questions. We have already Michael. Michael, go ahead with your question.
I really like this concept you're talking about, corporations with a constitution, like kind of, I guess it's the charter as a constitution. And so that implies the potential for democracy. So I've been thinking about West Virginia and I love using energy as a metaphor, using energy as such a great example for where democratization could be so impactful these days. And so, we have Joe Manchin in the United States, who is, senator of a coal state. And so who knows where his interests really lie, and he's blocking the entire Joe Biden agenda for a green power plant and all of that. But back to the core issue of a corporation like a coal company, if there was a way for the ordinary utility customers where they actually, like you were talking about equity, the people who are buying the product actually end up having a voice in what's going on. They understand what decisions could be made, how shifts to renewable energy could take place, even for a coal company to start investing in other areas of energy. So what is your framework? How does a constitution work within a corporate structure or how would it be introduced into a corporate structure to become a reality?
You'd have a general meeting of members, and the tax deduction would be conditional upon 3 changes to the corporation, the constitution. One would be that automatically each year by simple book entry, 5% of equity was transferred to a class of stakeholder shares. So that it's a much simpler and efficient way of creating employee ownership. At the moment, there's huge tax deductions in the United States. There's about 14 million citizens in the United States that are a member of an employee share ownership plan. So corporations are already giving away ownership to their employees, but it's a very complicated system of using bank loans to buy shares. This way, the shares are just given away. So that's one change. Over 20 years or so. The 2 other changes are create a division of power. There's no commercial reason for directors to have the power to both govern the corporation and manage the business. They're quite separate functions, and it makes their lives too complicated, too much information overload, too much power, and too many conflicts and unethical behavior. So you have the shareholders elect 2 boards, one to manage the business, the other to govern the corporation. It's not the European system. The European system, they still only elect 1 board that appoints the 2nd board, so you don't get a division of power. The 3rd changes in corporate constitution is self-regulation with stakeholders. Now, the model that inspired me was Ralph Nader. He set up in the United States what he called citizen utility boards, where the customers of public utilities volunteered to give money to set up an expert advocate to stop the utilities capturing the regulators about the pricing and conditions. So I envisage this third change in the corporate constitutions would be that any stakeholder constituency would have the right to form its own board of advice, and the corporation would have to fund that. So the workers, the suppliers, the customers, the host community, each of those different constituencies would have their own board, and those boards would have conflicts with other boards. So you get contestation, and you'd get feedback from the bottom up of how the environment was, what the quality of the services were, the conditions of work, and these would all become public knowledge. And this is exactly what Garry Fink said. He said he wants his share, the companies he invests in, to bring stakeholders to the table, to learn what's going on, to avoid groupthink. He specifically used the words, you've got to have diversity to avoid groupthink. And one way of getting diversity is engaging with the stakeholders and give them voice, and you give them influence. But you still maintain shareholder primacy, because those stakeholders are gradually going to become shareholders, and they want primacy.
Can I do a quick follow-up, Melanie? So you can speak to what's happening in Australia at a higher level. You've got to have some sort of collusion between the government and the coal. I mean, you're exporting quite a bit of coal, obviously, to Asia, and it's a part of your economy. Now, how can you deal with the fact that politicians are enabling, or encouraging the continuation of the coal industry, where in fact, separate from any kind of corporate structure, we need to phase out coal as fast as possible throughout the world. It's the worst carbon source. So what's going on in Australia, and how do you speak to that higher level of, political power and corporate power that's like fascism? And it's like, if they both want coal, then we got a real problem.
You've put it on, you're spot on. We have that problem. It's the collusion it's a tragedy of the commons. You've got the people with the power misusing that power. So you've got to go past them to the citizens and saying there's a better way. We've got to share the power, and we want you to seduce them away with a short-term profit for long-term sustainability. And that's the idea of the tax incentives for shareholders. It sounds paradoxical, it sounds inconsistent, but it's a way of seducing them with their own petard to make the world sustainable. There's no quick answer. You've got to go to the people in mass. You've got to get the voters of the people. You've got to tell them there's simple solutions to these of concentration of power, and you've got to turn the pyramids of power of society upside down. And as I said before, there's no graduate school of administration, business, or government that teaches how you design those constitutions which provide power for the people.
Wow. Wow, so interesting. Okay, we have another question. And Stephen, would you like to ask it, or do you want me to read it? Can you?
Yeah, I'm happy to ask it. Sorry, I had a crack today in my computer screen, so my camera is not on. It would be fuzzy. But yeah, Dr. Turnbull, the question is, so in your idea of the ownership transfer corporation, where every year 5% of the equity in that company is transferred by book entry to stakeholders. That's a pretty hard pill to swallow. If you're a current owner of that corporation who's not really a stakeholder, you're a passive investor. Over 20 years, you're going to lose 100% of your ownership. What specific tax incentive do you imagine could actually incentivize a corporation to adopt that kind of constitution?
Every tax jurisdiction is different, and you'd have to design your own incentives. But remember that corporations are giving away ownership to their executive as share plans and share options of some percentage each year, and they're having these buybacks, which we don't want anymore. I can't give you a direct answer because it's very specific. You might want to some people might want to have tax penalties if you don't do it, but you'd want to get a win-win solution for both. And what I'm suggesting, you need a incentive. The incentive is self-financing. So it may seem very generous. You need a very generous incentive to get them to do that. But remember that big institutions have a legal obligation to maximize short-term profits. And if the incentive gives them a short-term profit, the fact that they lose long-term ownership it doesn't matter, and it's not important. The idea is to make a bigger profit quicker with less risk, and that's what the incentive's got to be designed to. And there's experts who can design those sort of incentives, particular for those corporations. But remember, but one thing I should add, that when a corporation enters into become an endowment corporation, there's a tremendous incentive for the company to issue all its profits each year. It wants to pay back those shareholders as quick as possible. So it would grow by forming what I call offspring corporations. In other words, you'd have a dividend reinvestment process into new corporations set up to be a supplier or a consumer of the progenitor corporations. Now, this is how the Mondragon complex grew. They started off with one cooperative, and when it grew too big beyond human scale, it split into two, like an amoeba. It followed the processes you find in living things. And then it divided into two, and then it divided into three, and it kept on dividing and kept on growing. And now they've got 200 cooperatives and 80,000 people employed. The purpose of Mondragon in 1957, when it was started, was to create work for the unemployed. So it grew organically. And this is what ownership transfer corporations, endowment corporations would do. They grow organically by setting up new corporations with the clock ticking again and the process going again. So you have a serious sequential creative destruction of organizations. You'd have whole nested networks of families of corporations at different levels of technology competing against each other, being at human scale, and providing continuity for the investor and the managers in the offspring corporations. But the reinvestment decision transfers from management to shareholders. So the decision where to invest future funds from successful companies would be in the marketplace, not by the executives.
So interesting. And quickly, we're going to go to Glenn. Glenn, go right ahead.
I very much appreciate the overall consciousness, strategy, and ethics of bottom up, whether we're talking about economics or citizenship, where the whole world is my country, or all the other progress that we've made in every sector has been bottom up. The labor movement, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, going back centuries ago, the Reformation that says the Catholic Church can't have a monopoly on telling us what it is. You can actually read the Bible for yourself and figure it out in your own language, in German, Martin Luther said. And then the Quaker said, beyond that, you don't need any kind of a priest. You can connect directly with God. So I encourage people to find all kinds of ways in every sector where we can do bottom-up organizing throughout everywhere. And I put in the chat the invitation to contact me if you want free online workshops I conduct about nonviolent grassroots organizing, because we care about a lot of issues. We need to have a grassroots movement to change how our whole criminal justice system works, how we do local governments, how we do all kinds of things. So, but I very much appreciate the content today and the whole bottom-up thing. I just encourage us to do bottom-up, really profound democracy in every sector. Thank you.
Shann is clapping. It's his response. Wonderful. Thank you, Glenn, for that. And then now we have our last question. I'm going to just read Patrick's question to you, Shann. He's just said, the question is, what should people do with their money sitting in the banks?
You want to make sure the bank has a government guarantee is the first thing. And in Australia, they limit it to $250,000, which is not a problem to a lot of people, of course. But you need to invest in life-sustaining essential services. And one is solar, obviously solar cells and solar energy and renewable energy and food and transport. If you're looking, but I'm not an investment advisor. I'm not allowed to give you investment advice. but it is a problem because I think investing in fixed interest money or in government bonds, it's all funny money. And I think there's been a huge inflation of artificial assets. These artificial assets are called cryptocurrencies. And official money is an artificial asset. It's not backed by any reality. And as they've printed trillions and trillions of more dollars, bailing out the system, kicking the can down the road. And there's going to be a day of reckoning. I've been forecasting it for 30 years. And in this book, I wrote the root causes of economic breakdown. So I've been forecasting a crash for longer than I can remember. So I'm not a good forecaster on what to do. So please be cautious of my advice.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you for it anyway. And this has been so fascinating. Thank you, Shann. This is great. And now we're going to go back to Arthur. Arthur, take it away.
Well, I'm just so grateful. And you're a visionary thinker. And if you're not a forecaster, you're certainly a very inspiring thinker about how we can create some solutions. One of the top solutionaries. So tell us first, how can we go to your website? I know we can just search for your name on YouTube and see all kinds of great talks you've given. Just look up Shann. He's Shann, the man with a plan, Shann Turnbull on YouTube. But where can we specifically go to buy your books and to get more information?
I have no website. I use other people's, and relying on people like yourself and other intermediaries to store my information. My academic work is on an organization called the Social Science Research Network. I put all my academic papers there. They're a bit dense. They're not user-friendly. I've put on there the New Way to Govern. It's a little pocketbook which is commissioned by the London-based New Economics Foundation. They were tired of Thatcher privatization. They want an alternative to shareholder ownership. They didn't like government ownership, and the new way to govern was stakeholder ownership. And that little book if you print in the words "A New Way to Govern," my name, and put in, you can download it from the Social Science Research Network. Building Sustainable Communities is also on the Social Science Research Network, as is my parliamentary report to advise the Australian government on how to distribute mining royalties to Aboriginals in 1977, 1978. And I undertook the first economic analysis of Aboriginal communities for that parliamentary report that was the two reports were republished in 1980, and part of that is also on the Social Science Research Network. And in one of those chapters there, I got their story about Aboriginal money management. I went to the annual general meeting of the Good Island Trust Fund, where these traditional ownees had been managing their own money, and they did it in a much more superior and convincing way than I've seen done by the modern society. It was bottom-up decision-making.
Wow. Well, that sounds great. And speaking of bottom-up and Glenn's remarkable comment about that, we did recently have Rob Call on the podcast, who wrote a book, Bottom-Up Revolution. If you haven't seen that yet, go back to theworldismycountry.com/club. I put it in there, or the shortcut, peoplepoweredplanet.com. And go ahead and listen to that. Also, if you search for Sushiant, in our club, go back further. He won the Global Challenge Foundation's, one of the 3 top winners of the award for multi-million-dollar award for the best new ideas on how to govern our world, for his talk program of bottom-up democracy and using the new internet tools to create that. So that's what our whole podcast is about, folks. Bottom up. Many great speakers. If you're not signed up yet for our podcast, please do look at some of these great talks we've had. People like Hazel Henderson, who you know, and many others. And David Gallup, if the World Service Authority is still going, yes, listen to his podcast about the incredible power that the World Passport has to help people to to have an identity. The 50 million stateless people can use this to be able to, get into the courthouse to have their asylum case heard, to open bank accounts, to be able to have their kids vaccinated, medical care, schools. People don't have IDs, don't have anything. And the World Service Authority gives every citizen the right to have a document. So listen to his podcast and some of the others, and do join us. We'd love to have you join on a paid basis that sustains us, but there's also a free option if you can't afford that. But please do join us so you'll get the announcements. And those who are new today, come back every week for another exciting episode of the People Powered Planet podcast.
World citizen, lift up your voices. Oh, we got something to say. All we need is the same directions, heading in one way.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to our channel and like this video.